using my just my max recording. The sound will be medium quality, but at least we'll have one version. If someone else can record as well, that would be good.
Are you using, let's see, not iMovie, QuickTime?
Yeah.
To do that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe I can do that too.
Just wait a few minutes to get started if you want to record it.
Yeah. Is the rest of the audience okay with recording? Because, if there's Q&A, some people might object. So you might need to ask that question.
Well, people are going to ask questions through the chat. That's in my introduction. So if we have a question from the audience, then I will convey it to you. So we won't see them.
Okay, and Frode, I'm just double checking. Do I want just new screen recording or movie? I guess it's screen because movie is from the camera and audio is just so screen picks up audio as well?
When you click on it, there will be an option at the bottom of the screen where you have to click something for the audio.
I'm looking to see here.
For the audience that's just coming in, we're going to take one minute to see if we can record the session. And then we'll get started.
Microphone, yes, got it. And then hit record. So theoretically, I'm recording. I hope that's true. And Frode, you are as well?
Yes, I am. So, Joost, whenever you're ready to start, if you just mention it to people, and also please, if someone doesn't want something recorded, they can always tell us afterwards. We'll chop that off at the end if they say something, and that's how we usually.
Okay, we'll do it like that. That should work fine. Well, let's get started. Welcome to the closing event of the 10 Days of Metadata, organized by the Knowledge Network for Information and Archives, PIA, in the Netherlands. I have the pleasure and honor of presenting our illustrious panelists. I am Joost van Koutwijk, Provincial Archivist at the Utrecht Archives. And in this event, our panelists will present and discuss what they call visual meta, a new approach to deal with the keeping metadata for documents within the documents themselves, as opposed to traditional book, colophons, or PDF metadata. Frode Hegland will lead us through that, and keeping documents durable and interchangeable during their lifetime throughout the documents themselves. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Frode Hegland, Director of the Augmented Text Company in the United Kingdom and developer of Visual Meta. Vint Cerf, one of the fathers and architects of the internet, notably the TCP/IP protocol and email, by the way, and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google and inducted as pioneer of the Internet Hall of Fame. It's really an honor to have you here in this discussion. As is an honor to have back with us Dr. Ismail Serageldin, who gave his inspiring keynote on the 10 Days of Metadata last Wednesday. He's the founding director and currently emeritus librarian and member of the Board of Trustees at the new Library of Alexandria. We welcome questions from the audience before I introduce the panelists, which I just have. But if questions arise in the audience, they are more than welcome. We will be monitoring the chat in WebEx, so feel free to type in your question there. And if time provides, I will convey your question to our panelists. If we run out of time, we'll take liberty of forwarding your question via one of Mr. Cerf's inventions, email. The panelists will start with addressing the problem that Mr. Hegland is developing the solution for, and that's databases, documents, and the problems of keeping them durably linked. The first to address this is Mr. Cerf. The panelist who reacts to that is Dr. Serageldin, and following that, Mr. Hegland will provide us with the solution that he's working on, which is Visual Meta. Sure, if I can ask you to take it away, take the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this discussion. I want to take advantage of a moment to sort of restrain Frode, who is eager to show you what he's been up to say that what you will see is, in fact, a slice of a much broader problem. Frode is in the historically in the same mold as Douglas Engelbart, whom he knew. And Engelbart had this passionate connection with computers and people's ability to deal with knowledge. And he focused his creative energy on building something called the online system, which allowed people to create and share textual documents to make references to them. He had hyperlinking. He had to invent a mouse in order to point to things on the screen and say, this is where I want to edit. The thing that I want to emphasize is that once we have computers involved in the production of textual material, to say nothing of more complex objects like databases, we have an opportunity to make much deeper our ability to interact with, manipulate, make use of, and refer to text. And what Frode has been doing, not only in what you will see with the visual meta, but also more generally with some of his other author and reader tools, is a significant and deep provision of tools for interacting with text. And the reason I want to emphasize this is that it changes your entire experience of textual material when you have a computer that's helping you get access to it, organizing it, developing it, producing it, referring to other text, drawing pieces in, looking things up in the Wikipedia or in the online world, looking for definitions, picking up citations. I mean, there's this broad range of things that Frode's tools allow you to do. And the idea here is to not lose that richness especially over time. And you can imagine printing a document, but once it's in this black and white form, in this rigid and unchanging form, you lose virtually all of the ability to engage with it using all the power of computing. So the thing I want to emphasize is that Frode's work has been to create this interactive universe. And our concern, Ismail and mine and others, is the question of how to preserve the objects that are in that form over long periods of time so that they can be referenced in that form. You can engage literally with them. And just keep in mind, for example, a spreadsheet. You can print out the current state of a spreadsheet. People do this all the time. But to make use of the object means you have to interact with a piece of software. And so this is what I want to emphasize, that we want to preserve over the long term that capability to have that kind of rich interaction and to put the objects into a larger universe where others have created similar documents. And the World Wide Web is a kind of mechanism that illustrates at least a slice of that, because you can click on a link and go to another document and pull it in. The browsers of the day are so complex now that they're almost complete operating systems. When they ingest a piece of HTML5, they interpret it, and the interpretation can be very rich. And in spite of all that experience, a lot of what Frode has in mind is way past what the World Wide Web can do today. So I'll stop there. I thank you for letting me intervene. At this point, Ismail will help to paint an even broader picture of the challenge ahead, and then we'll hear from Frode. So, Ismail.
Yeah, thank you, Vint, and thank you, Jude. To put it in a direct way, I did hint at that in the opening keynote. What we are now having is not just what used to be collections of data. I mean, we had in the past, people would collect specimens, would collect books, would collect manuscripts, etc., etc. Now we have links between collections of data, which even in a normal sized library or archive, you will have a lot of different things. You will have maps, you will have custodial records of land transactions, you will have government budgets, you will have data sets, you have population censuses, and increasingly also the museums are creating digital presences for themselves on the internet, and the museum objects are themselves requiring an enormous set of questions concerning data. What is this object? How do you classify it? So it's becoming much more than a few keywords as we used to do with books. We have a much bigger frame of reference, and images are also becoming important, and the ability, for example, to link historical map of the same location over time, just to use one example, has become an important issue for a lot of people. So how do you ensure that you can do that, or do you compare, for example, how different maps of the same period, what they look like, etc. Some of these issues, when I was chairman of the World Digital Library, were being discussed among the librarians and chief librarians of many countries. But most recently, and I was telling our chair, Jude, there's been a disturbing development in the scientific community. And that disturbing development is that we have always learned that science advances by having a hypothesis, and then you do an experiment, and depending on whether the experiment is successful or not, you draw a conclusion, you say the hypothesis is supported or the hypothesis is rejected, etc., etc. And then other people will replicate that experiment and validate your work or not. That, however, has become impossible. Even in the best scientific journal, lately, I'm talking lately, like about 5 years ago, we're reaching a stage where a very large number of the scientific papers published cannot be tested, cannot be validated. Why? Well, because I don't have access to the data the scientists used. I don't have access frequently to the statistical techniques that were used to test this and validate. I mean, the first were the compatibility between the kind of data that he had. If part of it is the ratio data and part of it is cardinal data, well, you would have to use a profit type model and so on and so forth. Was that the case or not? That was not available. You have the conclusions, and it says that this has been peer reviewed, and there it is. So there's been a big movement now, a number of scientists, including the US National Academy of Sciences and others, including the European Union and the European Union Statistical Association. They participated in a movement which is called Open Science. And open science requires the ability to bring forward not only the conclusions that you have of what scientific work you're doing, but the original data, the hypothesis, the programs that you use, the testing for that, the conclusions that you arrived at. And here we find something a little bit about the peer reviewers, what they said, and the arbitrated, the referees on how much this was taken into account, and then the final paper would be there. Now, that would allow a lot of people, including others that have a slightly different idea, to be able also to use the same data, partly to revalidate the work of the scientists, which is supposed to be the original way we work on most of science, and partly to develop their own ideas from the same data. And so data pooling has become important on one level. Then that's what I did, data pooling, and then it goes out like that, and then it comes back in again. And increasingly, we have another problem, which is that we want multidisciplinarity. I mean, I've always said that data is just data. When data is organized, it becomes information. Information, if explained, it becomes knowledge. And hopefully, to chart policy, you also need wisdom, and thus the hard knowledge from the natural sciences needs to be linked with the insights of the social science and the wisdom of the humanities. Now, to make that, these different kinds of links between disciplines, even in the open platform where all are willing to work together, is proving this because of the nature of the data and the nature of the textual presentation is different between the social sciences, the humanities, and the natural sciences in most cases. So in that case, we are having one problem. That is not enough. We also have a major player that is now coming online with us, and that is museums. Now, museums have collections of objects, cultural objects, historical objects, paintings, sculptures, vases, cards, bits and pieces of things that date from thousands of years ago to the latest finding, etc. And they themselves are having a profound dialogue within museums about what is the role of museum. They used to be, the model used to be the Encyclopedic Museum, like the Louvre or the British Museum or the Rijksmuseum or the Metropolitan. And increasingly, people are questioning whether that is the proper function to do. And however you look at it, we definitely need more visual material. But having said all that, so you have the museums with their collections and connections between collections, you have text, you have maps, you have transactions, you have data sets that are numerical data sets, and all of that is digitized, but it's still with virtual reality, with holography, with interactivity being brought into many of these things. I think we will need a way of thinking about how the metadata that is traditionally associated with any particular element can link with other metadata, either for entire data or for other sets, how standards can or cannot be done. But ultimately, so far, the most fundamental instruments by which we communicate ideas and knowledge from, through time and space, one generation to another, sequentially, author writes something and then a reader reads it, or it travels from Brazil to China to the United States, and people open these documents and look at them and read them and interact with them. That still remains the fundamental means by which knowledge is being done right now. So I can see the framework evolving very rapidly, work in Stanford, IIIF and other places on imagery and connecting imagery and maps, for example, along with that. But text remains the most important piece. And in that sense, I believe our friend Frode Alexander Hegland has done a lot of work on how to change the workhorse of our current use of text, which is the PDF, and does a lot of things that are way beyond that as well. So I think I should say, pass it over to him and let him say something about what he is doing in that area.
Thank you, Ismail. Joost, shall I share screen for the presentation?
Yes, please do.
Okay. It's not very long. It should be about, let's see, 10, 15 minutes. Hang on, I've got all kinds of options here. Okay, are you guys seeing my screen well?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm not used to WebEx. I just want to make sure that you don't obscure the screen for me. Okay, good, I've got that. So first of all, I want to say thank to Vint and Ismail for being amazing people, and for Kia to inviting us here today. It's an absolute fantastic honor, especially since we didn't have to fly. It's awful weather outside, so I'm very happy to be doing this from home. So the point of this is to increase the power of the written word, and I'm fully aware that I'm speaking to the choir in this introduction. by making documents more powerfully interactive to support faster and deeper reading as well as more thought-out writing. By adding a few words at the end of a book or a document. This approach builds more richly interactive environments where the elements and the environments are more aware of themselves, what their characteristics are, and their context. The key is to let documents know more about who they are, how to cite them, what they contain, and how they are structured. The goal is virtual information landscapes, not just frozen pixels. As I said, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I had to state where we're coming from. So this is kind of the starting position. This is a paper book, and one of the first pages of a paper book, as you've all seen, has what's variously called edition notice, copyright page, etc. It is, of course, metadata about that book. So here is PDF metadata. Kind of a joke, because there's hardly any metadata in PDF at all. It doesn't have the name of the authors, publication, or even the title of the document. So visual meta, and I'm using this animation to really highlight the point, is an appendix. It is something that we stick at the back of the document, similar to what you have in a book at the front of the document. And this is really, really important to highlight. It is not a new standard. It is an approach. I'm sure most of you have seen this cartoon situation. There are 14 competing standards. Ridiculous, we need one universal standard. Yeah, soon. Situation, there are now 15 competing standards. This is actual BibTeX, mostly, with a bit of JSON. The structure is very simple. There's an introduction where the visual meta introduces itself. It says what version it is and stuff like that. Then we have a bit of a bibliographic or citing thing. This is 100% exactly what it would look like in BibTeX. And then the structural stuff, such as saying what the headings are in the document. This can even include saying who authored a section in the document. For instance, the book that Vint and Ismail and I have been working on, The Future of Text. It's 180 wonderful contributors. So if you cite from that book, you really should be citing from the individual authors and not from the editor. So there are many ways of categorizing metadata, as you all know much better than me. But in the really simple way that I look at this, there's a little bit of metadata, but most of this is actually retained structural data. It is stuff that is in the manuscript already that normally just gets thrown away. In the visual meta that is exported, there's also a long introduction to what it actually is. The reason for that is, as both Vint and Ismail were talking about, this is for the long haul. If someone who doesn't have access to us wants to use this data now, they can just read this and figure it out. If someone wants to do this in 1,000 years, they come across one of these documents, it explains what this metadata is. We're also looking at how we can do semantic encoding. For instance, I know you guys have been talking quite a bit about location addressability. That can easily be added, either formatted as BibTeX or JSON. But the really important thing is that if you put in a value, you have to say what it is. In this case, it says latitude and longitude. So you can't just put in numbers because someone could get that wrong. We all know about rockets and meters and feet. It also adds paratexts, which I personally think is very, very exciting. Your references, glossary, endnotes, whatever you have, is also made discoverable through this system. And a glossary is included also in full and inside the visual meta. I will mention the benefit of that in a minute. So some people, including you, Joost, have been asking questions like, how does this compare with something like Dublin Core? And because of the meeting we had yesterday, I decided to do what I thought was obvious, but I had clearly not communicated, and that is, there's no reason why Dublin Core could not be inside Visual Meta. So here's an example Dublin Core bit of information, metadata, that just happens to be put in there because that is what these publishers would want the document to have. So anything that you have that you would have put in here, just say what it is. The screen may be small for some of you, so I just want to highlight, it says at Dublin Core. I'm seeing a written thing there. We get to questions later unless it's very important. But Marc-Antoine, could you anything like that as long as it's self-declaring what it is. Another cool thing we're looking at is an appendix after the appendix, because remember, this is literally a page at the end. So I have the Future of Text book here, which is a thick book with lots of good stuff in it. You should all get it, it's all free. Just search for the Future of Text and you'll find it. And here is the visual meta. It's just printed really, really small. There's no reason why it should be pleasant to read, because it's only read either by a machine or someone who has a special need for it later. So you can have an appendix after that that has annotations. So for instance, any highlights in the book can be covered, or a document could be covered there, plus amendments and workflows and so on if people have had to deal with a document. So for the benefits, in advanced interactions while reading, one of the basic ones is most documents, PDF or otherwise, tend not to have an outline or headings included. With this system, it is encoded, so whatever reading software, and in our case, we produce a macOS word processor called Author, which exports with flawless visual meta, obviously, because it's our test platform, and a macOS application called Reader, which can take advantage of the visual meta and show the interactions that I'm highlighting here. So folding, you just click a button or pinch or whatever it might be for the software, and you have an outline of your document to jump around in. One of the irritating things about not reading on paper is you come across a citation or an endnote, and if it's digital, you have to either click or just scroll to the back of the document, find out what it is, and you have to find your way back. With this system, because Visual Meta makes the reader aware of the formatting, all you need to do is click on a citation and it'll show you the full citation information. You can then choose to click inside that little pop-up to download that document should you wish. We're also looking at ways that if you already have that document on your hard drive /cloud, you can click on this, the system will say, you already have this, do you want to open it? You open it straight away without that barrier. And of course, also endnotes can show up like this. So glossaries are really interesting things. In our software Author, we have a mind mapping, concept mapping way of dealing with glossary terms, which is a little outside of this. But imagine you worked really hard in your field and you've defined specific text in your glossary. What the reader system can do with Visual Meta is, first of all, on a normal document with normal text, click on text, for instance, the word text here, do Command F for find, and it will show you all the occurrences of the word text in the document. You can scroll up and down, click on one to jump to it, or do Command F to go back to where you were. However, and this is the thing that Visual Meta brings to the table, if the term the reader selects is in the glossary, then if you select it, such as Doug Engelbart right here, and do Command F, you do get all the occurrences of the document further down in the page here, but at the top, in this little gray bar, it has the glossary definition. So the user doesn't even need to know about glossaries. This is kind of given for free. But the coolest thing, I think, that makes this very exciting is, again, it's probably very small on your screens if it's all framed, but that some of the glossary definition text is bold, just like the term itself. That means it is another term. So you can click on it, and then you get that definition. So you can then smoothly go through the document and follow someone's glossary to see how they've chosen to connect the text. One I haven't illustrated, but we're looking at, is changing the citation style. You can export in Harvard, someone can read it in Vancouver or whatever. If it's all encoded, that should be clearly possible. It surprises me every day how much academia care about cosmetics, but that's another story. Augmented citing, that means copying from a PDF, pasting in a word processor as a full citation. Let me show you. Copying a bunch of text, going to the word processor, pasting, that's it. You click on what's pasted and you can see it's a full citation. That was the original core benefit of Visual Meta, because the PDF document doesn't just give the copied text to the clipboard, it gives the Visual Meta as well, which, as you saw earlier, is actually BibTeX. So the authoring software says, thank you for the text and the citation information. I'll make a full citation. So when this user now chooses to export in the future to a new PDF, this will be automatically included in the references. It also enables computational text, as Vint was discussing earlier, and it's a term he came up for. Thanks, Marc-Antoine. that he came up with that I think is really important. I'm illustrating it with a banal example here. But because at the end of the document, it's human and computer encoded semantic value, what's in the document, you can have a simple equation that someone can click on and change, or something complicated. And the reader software can be built in different ways to take advantage of that. The opportunities here are just staggering. It allows servers to know what's inside the documents. That was kind of hinted at in the beginning, but the point is that if you have a table or a graph or whatever it is in the document, it can be encoded what the X and Y axis are, which would normally be lost. So a server can go through millions of documents and say, I'm interested only in charts that have this certain information. Sorry, so I saw that question, it looked interesting. Joost, do you mind reading it, please? It kind of, the question in chat just kind of escaped me.
I would mute it. That was the question by Marc-Antoine. It's probably worth having a URL to the visual meta file, or even better, the content addressable ID of the file in an immutable file system such as IPFS. I must confess that I don't know what that is. Maybe also QR code version of the URL.
Yeah, so all of that is really important, and thank you, Joost, for reading that. We want to put these into some kind of a chain. There are many different ways we're looking at it, and that's a real benefit. But the core of this is that the visual meta is not separated from the meta, because we really feel that if you say the context and the meta information is as important as the information, why put it somewhere else? There's nothing wrong with also having it somewhere else. That can be very, very valuable for many reasons. But this is about having something in an object. And that goes to the last two benefits, which is this is completely legacy safe, because it is just, sorry to repeat myself, but it's just extra text at the back of a PDF document. That means it is so robust, this document can even be printed, scanned. If you run optical character recognition on it, then nothing is lost. So if you have important documents with all this data, and the visual meta can be a few pages, it can be a lot of stuff in there. But you can print it, put it in a vault, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, it'll still be there. No computational stuff is ever lost. So in closing, to highlight, the goal is to increase the power of the written word by adding a few words at the end of a document to describe what the document is in a human and computer readable manner. It is a simple proposal which can provide the means for powerful interactions in a robust way. And of course, those of you who know me, here is my son, he just turned 4. I strongly feel that if we don't do this to make information better for the next generation, there really is not much of a point. For more information, in addition to talking to us today, you can go to visual-meta.info. And for the future of text, just search the future of text, and quite scaringly, you will find us. Back to you, Joost.
Thank you, Frode. Well, we did have a question that you addressed during your presentation. I was also wondering. Well, you also addressed the Dublin Core question. There are specific standards for records management and archival description that our viewers are using or are going to use, or at least there were presentations about them in the last 10 days of metadata. For example, records and contexts, a Dutch government standard MDTO based largely on ISO 23081, so metadata for records. Have you experimented with archival sources and visual meta yet?
The only archival source we have is our own massive book. That's it, which was produced in InDesign. So our own software was actually irrelevant. And this was entirely manually made. It's really to highlight the fact that it is an approach. It is just written stuff. There's no magic tech behind it. We are, however, talking to a really interesting organization, thanks to you, Vint, which has a beautiful body of work that really don't want to talk about yet, but we're going there. We'd like to talk to more. The use case currently is just one student writing one paper for one teacher. But that is more of a workflow so that it's really clean. If we can augment existing documents, we would like to do that. Because this appends a PDF page onto current content. It doesn't destroy what's ahead of it. So if there is a process to add this meta, it can handle it. And as we've also discussed earlier, this is not competing with anything. It is only in addition to. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Ismail, please. Sorry, unmuting you. Yeah. You're still muted, I'm afraid. Oh, here we go.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to add to that in fact, one of the areas where this will become very important, now we're having a few words early on about the notion of provenance and so on. But what is important is also going to be that over time we'll have multiple versions of objects or of books. We know first edition, second edition, etc. But that's in books, it is more or less structured. But take, for example, we have film. Film is very valuable, and it's one of the areas where we have seen both the technical obsolescence as well as the physical obsolescence. Marty Scorsese was visiting with me in Alexandria, and we had a 2-day seminar, and we discussed, and he told me, in fact, he showed me some images. He says, even films that were as important as, say, My Fair Lady, which was a huge thing, look at the quality of deterioration that has happened to the nitrate base of the negative film. And he spends a lot of time trying to restore that. So we have seen here how physical obsolescence can begin to interfere and destroy with somebody who wants to see that particular work, which is not the same as reading a book by Dumas or even Dante's Inferno. So you have that. And in the movie itself, you have a movie is done usually 3 times. You have a screenplay, and then you have the actual shooting of the movie, and then you have the editing. And now we're beginning to see interest in the director's cut versus the final studio cut and what was released to the public. And in fact, a lot of the thoughtful, critical, analytical stuff that is being done today, people want to compare these various editions and see that. And they are, in a sense, running against time, because not all of them have been digitally remastered, as the word is. And the object itself, in compare, some of its stages and some of its phases have disappeared or are in the process of disappearing. So we have a much more complex example in that. And we will have that in many, many other things. I mean, just think of different versions of games. I'm old enough, I remember Pong, the very first video game. You know? But when you see the amount and complexity of what is going on, when people will want 50 years, 100 years from now, and incidentally, I mean, that is precisely the kind of language that archivists are concerned with. I mean, we are preserving things for all time. As you said, Frode, whether it's 1 year or 1,000 years, that should still be retrievable, what we're trying to do. So I think we are, in a sense, just at the start. We are, as Frode said, in one of the easiest and simplest parts of that, because you're talking about the provenance and development of a particular document and embedding it with the document. That's an important innovation. So it doesn't disappear. 10 years from now, 100 years from now, you can go back and find both the provenance and the evolution of it as required. And the glossary and the other things of that will help. Finally, I think that, yes, we will need standards because also you have the other side of that, which is driven by science. If we're talking today about environmental issues and so on, and we bring in people's behavior, and we bring in measurements of degrees centigrade, and we bring in weather conditions, and we bring in food security. And from these related disciplines, they have totally different data organization, data storage, and being able to cross over from one to the other is proving difficult in the open science. So the platforms that we are designing right now, I'm the co-chair of the African Open Science Platform, requires us to assist, in fact, different groups to work together. Although most people recognize the importance of multidisciplinarity, to have diverse disciplines represented in understanding how you deal with phenomena such as virus phenomena and so on, why some people can't get access to the virus, some people have access and refuse to take it, vaccine, etc. You have the social dimensions, psychological dimensions, etc., that are being brought into the analysis of this phenomenon. And it is no longer just a simple thing, but especially how do you connect all of these things together to have a better insight in how to deal with it and formulate a policy is becoming difficult. And therefore, the viability of at least starting from that point where we are with Frode, and the robustness of that and the simplicity of that is very appealing. Question is, can we actually at a later stage expand that to a multiplicity of disciplines and of objects and of collections, and the connections between the collections and how they can be maintained over time?
You are referring to open science and science as an example. Now, a lot of us in the audience are dealing, governmental information, government policy. We see the same problem there: accountability and government policy, and getting a grip on all the information sources that were used when formulating that government policy. That could also be, for example, statistical information. Are you also looking into those fields?
Yeah, well, yes, the general idea is that it would be, I mean, with open science, you have access to a lot of things, not just the published literature, but you also have what we call the gray literature. Gray literature is mostly a report. Like, for example, there was a mission from WHO to such and such a location, and the three members wrote a report, a back to office report about what they found, and so on. That doesn't get published as a formal book, but there's a lot of enormous value in that. And especially when you think that you have gray literature, let's say for country A and country B and country C, and they're right next to each other. Actually, if you pool that gray literature, it becomes helpful, especially if you have pests and diseases that are crossing boundaries, or you have agricultural phenomena, or so on. Secondly, there is a very different type of sources of information. If you want, for example, to look at the gender dimension of poverty in rural areas in North Nigeria, for example, or something of that nature, well, there will be anthropological interviews, there will be films, there will be records of music, there will be records of actual fieldwork, there is satellite data, there is statistical data being produced, and that also has to be in some way integrated in order to formulate a policy. And one of the problems that we have in organizing data in that sort of situation is that, as somebody once said, if you're talking about the consumption of petrol in a country, you really don't care about the individual cans of petrol, what happened at the, so you lose that information. Who was able to find the thing? And in the same way, we lose it. But right now, because of Vint's wonderful inventions of the internet and so on, and the cloud and all of that stuff now, we don't lose it. We just leave them in completely to diverge into silos that are different from each other. And the ability to bring them together is part of what open science would do. And open science, therefore, would be able to make accountability possible for the formulation of government policy.
I think I can see Mr. Cerf wants to react to that.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. First of all, Frode, thank you so much for such a concise example and demonstration. As always, beautiful. I just want to point out something about context and infrastructure for a moment. These ideas are extremely appealing, but they imply the existence of certain contexts and certain infrastructure. For example, some of them will imply the existence of software that knows how to interpret the metadata. Let me take the internet and the World Wide Web as an example. Its current structure is heavily invested in XML or HTML5 and certain formats, and also a bunch of other assumptions like the domain name system and references to URLs and things of that kind. Having information distributed in this way is not necessarily useful unless you have ways of finding it. And so the standards are only part of the solution. Having search engines like the Google search engine, which indexes an enormous quantity of material and makes it possible to find it by supplying enormous amounts of computing power to sort through all this stuff. The obvious point here is that as we try to make things more uniform and standardized, which is very helpful, we also have to realize that we need an enormous amount of infrastructure, which is somehow self-supporting, that business model is, so that we can exercise the value of the standardization of the metadata. And we shouldn't forget that we have that effort to put forward if we want the benefits of these ideas to materialize over long periods of time.
I think we have an added question from Guido in the audience. For you, Mr. Cerf. Can visual meta, techniques like visual meta, help search engines to value found documents? So what should you add in the visual meta for your text to help search engines find and value those sources?
So I'm sure that Ismail and Frode have some answers here too. One thing that, remember that when we are looking at web-based pages for a moment, we see everything. And so we index everything. Mm-hmm. And so if web-based pages had this kind of visual metadata in it, we would see it and could potentially recognize it and make use of it, index it, make it discoverable. The thing which is often frustrating is that we also have a large amount of dark information in the internet, and I don't mean by this the dark web. I mean information which is in a form which doesn't get indexed. And so think of, databases are a good example. And I know that Tim Berners-Lee tried very hard to deal with the semantic web ideas, and I think they didn't pan out. But the idea was to find a way to allow the contents of a database to be somehow recognizable during the course of doing an index. And Frode's ideas and the notion of things being in sort of plain text form, which is sort of the simplest way you can represent them, it feels like it has the right flavor to it to allow the metadata to be exposed and indexable. But I love the idea of trying to tackle things like that in order to make things discoverable.
I think an interesting extra question for you, Frode, if I may. There's an extra question here that I'm thinking of. A lot of the online courses at Hegland older scanned documents. So what could we do with techniques like visual meta to help get those more findable for search engines, for example?
So many things coming up. It's so hard to be quiet. So many things. Okay. So on that issue, first of all, if you download a document that has a DOI, such as from ACM, the reader we have implemented will say there is a DOI in the front page. You don't have visual meta. Should I resolve it and add it automatically? And I say, sure, you go ahead. So it can be appended at the end of it. How you would do that for new archival data, so to speak, or new legacy data is, I think, entirely a human-computer issue of how you actually deal with that. Because a couple of things that are so important to highlight. when it comes to standards, yes, standards are important, but all this is doing is saying, hey, check the last page. There may be Dublin Court, there may be BibTech, there could be something juicy on the last page. That's all this is saying, right? And the different people who are reading it for different reasons will have different needs for what that is. And that relates to a question about glossaries further back, which was, could you have different glossaries for different user groups? Yes, absolutely you could. The way we're building it now is to help a student think. So you define and you link. It's a different approach. Feel free to look at the website if you want to. But the point is that you can, when you write it as a teacher, I assume that other people either are or have been teachers here, the first thing that you say to someone with an idea is, if it's important, write it down. You learn what something is by writing it down. It's the same thing here on every level. If it's important, write it down. If it's important from an archival point of view, write it down. And don't hide it. That's 99% the message. But one little thing that Ismail said that was really fascinating, talking about movies, edit decision lists, editing and all that stuff. We do have that with documents too. I hope PDF one day will gracefully die and we get something much more vibrant, but it's what we have. So we have a problem in our community right now. So we published this book that I keep showing, Future of Text, and we're going to do one every year. And we have now a book we're calling The History of Text, which is just a timeline, and a lot of us are just putting items in. How are we going to publish it? Are we going to publish it as 3 different documents? Yes. But we're also going to publish it as an anthology where they're all one PDF. That means that you can do interactions. You look up web or whatever it might be, and you search these 3 documents together. It also means that when you're talking about provenance, if you have a wrapper style PDF, you can do a hash of the document, and then you add this at the end, as long as it's not part of the document in the traditional sense. We can redevelop this. I mean, not only saying this because of Ismail and Vint, I am literally a nobody, but in the Mac ecosystem, I own the word author and I own the word reader. That's crazy. That shows that if you're passionate about this, you can create the software that can create a new ecosystem. I mean, Vint, when you were working on the internet, there weren't adults in the room. You just did it, right? It's the same with how we connect documents today, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. That's true.
I'm seeing Sam says HTML standards have meta tag. Yes, absolutely, that can be included. There was also something higher up.
A question you.
Yeah, but I think we're covering them quite well.
Quite well, yeah.
It's Vint. I just want to mention one other thing. Because of the need for software to exercise these ideas, we also have to start thinking about archiving of software. We have to think about archiving operating system versions. We have to think about archiving versions of applications and the like. Because if we don't keep the tools around, it's going to be hard to take advantage of all of the things that we've created using those tools or that require those tools for best application. And so the archivists who worry about content need to start worrying about the tools, and we need to work with companies that make the tools so that they adopt practices that will allow those tools to be preserved. And we're not anywhere close to that yet with all of the arm wrestle over intellectual property and maintenance of operating systems and access to source code and escrow and all this other stuff. So I just want to make sure you all understand that in order to take advantage of all this over time, we have to solve an even bigger problem than the ones that we've been talking about.
Or print it out as well. But there's something really important that I completely haven't mentioned, and that is, it was only a tiny bit earlier when I showed you copy as citation. That's really, really key, because that is a way you can interoperate between systems. For instance, we have a nice little basic graph thing, but Marc-Antoine, who's here today, he has a fantastically sophisticated one. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to copy back and forth. And when Ismail was talking about being in literally the jungle, no internet, basic software, you should be able to write stuff and have your location recorded at the same time. Software like that isn't that hard to make, but the key is how do you then get that piece of data into the rest of it? And that's where basic things like simple copy with a full rich context can come into play. So I think everything's covered there.
Yeah, there's an interesting question from Mark and Barrett, right? That I hadn't thought of before, but it's very logical for archivists. He says there should be a way, repository or other, to attribute visual meta a posteriori to existing documents that do not yet have it.
Yeah.
Because most of the documents we have are maybe centuries old. How do you address that?
Well, that's kind of close to what we talked about a little while ago, and it is really a human-computer interface issue more than anything. Because at the end of the day, technically, it's just writing at the end of the document, author equals name, end quotes, and all that stuff. So if there is known databases somewhere, you can just have it pasted in quite literally. So it depends what actual data you have for that. If you have nothing, you can hire a human to sit down and, okay, what's the name of this document? Okay, title is so-and-so, and do it that way. Obviously, a very important issue, but I think it is something that it comes down to the specific document type you're talking about. I'd be very happy to engage in conversation on that, but generally, it has to be a specific answer, I think.
I'd like to sort of also complicate things further because just reality. Where, as archivists, in a sense, you're used to having completed documents, as you said, hundreds of years old or tens of years old or whatever, but they're there. They're kind of dead. They don't move. They don't change. But all of us have been involved, for example, with Brewster Cable and the Internet Archive. And I had the only copy of the Internet Archive outside of San Francisco, was in Alexandria for about 10 years. Now, the key point there is that we were cataloging and maintaining websites. We would send out robots that would photograph every page on every available website, publicly accessible website, 4 times a year. Now, the problem with that is that the websites change. If I tell you, take this second edition of Kenneth Arrow's work and so on, and look at it, and you will find the same line on page 153 that I found that somebody else will find. If I refer you to a website, within 2 hours, it may have been updated, graded. So we had the Wayback Machine was a way of taking multiple pictures of that and keeping it so, but you would then look for the website itself and see its transformation. Now, Google, of course, has done an enormous amount of work, both on digitizing books, along with the Happy Trust and so on, Google Books, what, 22 million books by now, Vint, I don't know, but certainly an enormous work, and has indexed everything so that you can actually look for individual paragraphs, individual sentences, and so on. But the web itself is growing very, very fast. And the question will become then, if you are just posting material and then that material gets edited and changed and amended and so on, the sequence and progression of the transformation of the document becomes important. I see Vint wants to come in.
Yeah, we wanted to react to that.
It's been, I need to jump on another call, but I just wanted to mention one last point for me anyway, and that is, I want you to think about quantum computing for a moment. Think about the quantum states that you can get into and take advantage of in order to do sophisticated computations. Now think about a document. What state is the document in? And one answer to that is the entire history of the production of the document. And in our documents at Google, in Google Docs, we keep the entire history of the document. Every modification that's been made is part of the state of the document. You can imagine exporting an object that retains that state. And so the web pages, if they could be represented in a way that retains the history of modification, would allow you to go back in time in a more regular, reliable way than the current Wayback Machine has to do by taking fixed images. Let me excuse myself. I apologize, but I have to get on this other call. Jos, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this. Thank you, Frode. Thank you, Ismail, and thank you all of the participants for great questions. I hope to see you all on the net.
Thanks,
Thank
Vint.
you very much, Cerf. It was an honor having you here.
See you later.
We have to think about wrapping up as well because it's 3 o'clock here at least. I want to put one last question to you, Frode, and to Dr. Serageldin, if I beg your indulgence for a few more minutes. And that's, what are the first steps as archival institutions that we should take here? We want to, we want to be a part of the knowledge world wide web, and we like to see ourselves as an authoritative source for information and, growing on the internet. So, what are the first steps, keeping in mind that provenance is also a very important part in our field? The first steps that we should take to combine that with considerations for implementing visual meta.
You Dutch people are so direct, which is brilliant. No nonsense here. It's a great question, and I feel honored that you could even bother ask it, because it implies someone may actually do this. So I could imagine a librarian walking around in a collection, books or whatever, with a pencil and a tiny piece of paper, and picking up the object and writing on the back of it, this is so-and-so and this is so-and-so. Forget all the technology, but what would you actually write on the back of that object? That's the first thing. This is basically Harry Potter magic, ideally, right? Because all you do is add a tiny bit of software on top of it. That then becomes an interactable piece of information about that object, whatever it is. And then the second half of it is, you picture a student who is hungry to learn about something in this area. How could you most powerfully present it to that student? Right? Again, think about Harry Potter, forget the technology. Remember, these object representations now know what they are. That's all. Visual meta is the tiniest sliver in between those two bits of magic.
And just start from there and expand. And don't, we archivists, we like to cram stuff full of information. Just don't start there.
Well, if you want, if it turns out that you over-engineer a visual meta for your particular field that's literally 10 pages long, who gives a flying monkey? It's fine. You know, this kind of data is cheap. It's at the back of the document. It doesn't bother the reader. Data-wise, it doesn't take up any space. So if you want to write 10 different ways of writing location, have fun, do it. Later on, when you're that student, whether young or old or whatever, and you're in that mode of how to extract it, you, obviously, as you know much better than me from your practical experience, you're going to find out which bit was actually useful and how. You don't need to restrict yourself. It's not an optimization issue, let's put it that way.
Okay, that's a very good message, I think. Don't restrict yourself. Dr. Serageldin, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, I would just have a parting shot for our colleagues who are professional archivists anyway. As you rightly said, this conference has been devoted to metadata. And I liked very much the quotation that metadata are love letters we send to the future, because based on that, people in the future will be able to understand what it is that we give them as a legacy. So I think it's extremely important work that you are doing. They will also discussed how you add provenance, how you add other contexts, etc., etc. I think that's very important. I see that we are on the cusp of a major transformation. For the first time, different institutions have developed their archives, and now everything is coming together. So the images, the legacy material for cultural heritage, the museum pieces I was talking about, and so on. And the cross-referencing is going to become enormous. Is this statue under terracotta or under ancient Egyptian or Mesopotamian, or is it for the period of which it came, or is it for what it is? Is an indication of a girl or a boy or whatever. So it belongs. This is why I said we are making not just collections, but connections between collections. and it belongs to a multiplicity of things. I mean, an Egyptian scientist, a citizen of the world, we are all have our own complexities, and objects have these complexities, and the systems that we choose to organize them in and make links between them, I think would be extremely powerful in allowing humanity to bridge that truly quantum leap in terms of the amount of information available. I mean, as of today, 1.7 megabytes per person per second is being added to the global amount of information. So how much of that do we want to keep, how to keep it, etc., is going to be a big challenge. And the profession itself will have to reinvent how metadata is used in the coming half a generation, shall we say. And the work that Frode is doing is very important because text still remains a fundamental way by which we express our ideas and we connect with each other through space and time. And thus, we're living in exciting times. Let's embrace it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that consideration. And
Can I add a little bracket?
Very important to as archivists and records managers alike. Did you have?
Just a little bracket to that. This idea of someone writing this stuff at the back of an object. Don't forget, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, please don't think I'm being arrogant, I'm just trying to be clear. Metadata is not, of course, static. When someone writes down, this is a man or a woman, like Ismail said, that is their interpretation at that point in time. So if that is in a manuscript, you have the structural and all that other data about when that was written. So when I'm talking about, have fun, make it huge. If you add metadata about the metadata, and then later on that metadata changes in another appendix, you have that history of how that object was interpreted. So all this thing is saying is the stuff at the end of the document, have a look. And thank you very much for your time today.
And thank you for taking the time for the closing panel, these 10 days of metadata. There were a few questions that I didn't ask, probably because I missed them. We would like to forward them to you via email, if we may. And yes?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, if someone has a problem with the recording of this, both Vint and I recorded, if there's any questions you don't want included or anything, or whatever, please, via just tell me. It'll take a while before I can even compress this video. It's currently at 12.02 gigabytes. Crazy.
Yes. If you have issues with that, please tell the organization, and we'll make sure Frode gets them. Let me conclude with a very warm welcome. Thank you. Very warm thank you for our panelists, Hegland, Serageldin, and of course Vint Cerf, who had to leave a little early. And lastly, if people in our audience want to get involved, check out the site visual-meta.info, and of course you can Google for the future of text. And thank you for everyone on behalf of the people behind 10 days of metadata for attending all the discussions that we've had in the last 10 days. And we hope to see you again at future KIA events.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Look forward. Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Have a good weekend.